Film companies often look to recent hits in order to determine their path forward. This is a fine strategy to pursue, as film studios are businesses first and creative places second. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all imitators of this new kid in town can't be worthwhile as well. There have been trends of westerns, musicals, gangster films, spy films, and plenty of others, and these are just results of an evolving industry. For example, when Die Hard came out, everyone pivoted towards everyday men as action heroes rather than the buff macho men of Schwarzenegger, and many subsequent films were called Die Hard on a Plane, Die Hard on a Cliff, or Die Hard on a Bus. In 2008, we had the dual successes of Iron Man and The Dark Knight that quickly led to an oversaturation of superhero films, though much like with the Die Hard trend, several really great efforts came out of this rush. In the late 1970s, sci-fi films were coming back in a big way. This was heralded by the earlier successes of the Planet of the Apes films and 2001: A Space Odyssey, but 1977 really clinched it, with both the original Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind doing big business. Further sci-fi films followed, some of which were in production before these earlier two's release dates, including Superman the Movie, Alien, Blade Runner, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Buck Rogers of the 25th Century, and H.G. Wells' The Shape of Things to Come. Originally, the plan for James Bond was to do a film titled For Your Eyes Only, but United Artists and Cubby Broccoli shifted gears towards the space-sounding title of Moonraker and crafted a film that endeavored to top the successful The Spy Who Loved Me in every conceivable way in order to capitalize on this latest movement. A British airplane carrying the Moonraker shuttle crashes in the Yukon, but MI6 finds no sign of the Moonraker within the wreckage. Puzzled, they send James Bond out to Drax Industries to confront the CEO about this enigma. Bond quickly finds that there is more going on than a hijacked shuttle, finding remnants of tech documents that point to major production locations in Venice and Rio. Bond goes to each in turn to discover what Drax may be planning, while being shadowed by two henchmen of his, Chang, a martial arts master, and the towering Jaws returning from the previous film. He also finds that there is a CIA mole within Drax Industries named Dr. Holly Goodhead. Working with her, they discover a secret shuttle launching base in the Amazon. In order to stop Drax, the two must follow him even into the coldest reaches of space to prevent global destruction. The original novel is one of Ian Fleming's very best works, and it's surprising they still had that title left to go through given that they were about to start using the titles of the short stories. The filmmakers retained much of the crew from Spy and set about creating an original tale. I'm very much of two minds about this choice. On the one hand, Cubby was right in that trying to adapt the book's plot about a rocket destroying London in the 70s would have been seen as a poor escalation from Spy, whose villain tried to destroy the world. If your direction is to surprise and delight audiences, going bigger in scale is a viable option, and at this point, emboldened by the success of Spy, it seemed like a valid way to go. Plus, the series has already teased the idea of going into space before, with You Only Live Twice coming within shooting distance of the notion. On the other hand, this is one of the more lazily constructed plots in the series. It's fairly obvious that they're pretty much copying major beats from Spy, which in itself borrowed elements from Twice. Now, that's not really a big problem for me. My issue is that the story is being driven by the needs of the formula rather than the characters. Bond only ends up in each major location by breadcrumbs he found in the previous location. He is led to Venice by a document showing Venetian glass vials. He then goes to Rio because of a company shipping stamp on a box. He heads to the Amazon because the gas's formula is derived from a native plant. When he goes to the Amazon, he has no idea what he will find or if Drax is even there. If Jaws and crew hadn't tried to kill him, Bond might have been too late to stop Drax. But even after that, he only finds the base because one of Drax's girls is provocatively leading him there. I feel like the connecting tissue of the story is razor thin. He goes to a location because the story needs him to. Other Bond films have this problem to a degree, but Moonraker is the biggest offender of this that I can think of. Beyond that, the film tries to employ the same tongue-in-cheek tone from the past film, and it ends up not really either being charming or funny. The script just doesn't have the wit from before, and a lot of the humorous bits fall flat or are ridiculously silly. Jaws being played more for laughs, having a girlfriend shorter than him that somehow doesn't have braces, a gondola in St. Mark's Square with all the reactions from the crowd, the musical in-jokes. It all ends up feeling like the movie is trying too hard to go for an objective marker on some imaginary board to success rather than feeling natural. It's a movie that feels very mechanical in its construction, and aside from its grand scale, it comes dangerously close to feeling like just another random, uninspired film in the series. Granted, Bond is a very formulaic series, and you could accuse plenty of other films like Octopussy or Tomorrow Never Dies of being very standard. And you'd be right. A Bond film doesn't have to be at the forefront of innovation to be enjoyable, but it does need to have some spice to it, which I could cite those films as having. Moonraker just feels bland for much of its runtime, and thus it's not one that I ever really go back to. Roger Moore is consistently fun in most of his films, and he brings that same consistency here. I do think his shtick of one-upping people and his random knowledge gets overplayed a bit, but Moore is doing his best to have fun with the material. He doesn't get as many opportunities to play the cooler side of the character, but I don't mind him going for charm over danger. My favorite bit, though, is one of the few moments where he does get to play cool. During the shooting scene with Drax, he deliberately misses a bird and hits a camouflaged assassin in a nearby tree. It reminds me a lot of the gag in Thunderball where Bond casually shoots the target while being so natural, as it elicits the same response from me. Gosh, he's just so cool, isn't he? There's a couple of fun one-liners here and there, but most don't feel as sharp as before, and I do think there's an overabundance of them. Lois Chiles as Dr. Holly Goodhead is very much a character in the same boat as Anya Masova from the previous film. She's a fellow agent working on the opposite side of the investigation, she's just as capable as Bond, she has a somewhat frosty and hostile relationship with him early on, and she gets kidnapped by the main villain. Thankfully, she doesn't spend the climax tied to a chair like Anya did, so there's that. Plus, the name is one of the most memorable in the series. Chiles also seems to be capable of more acting range than Barbara Bach, but her line readings are almost as flat as Bach's was. Was there just something going around at this time, or did the ADR supervisor decide that emotionless readings from women were fine? It gets in the way of my enjoyment of their scenes. I also feel like it was a mistake to try to repeat the opposite agents warming up to each other thread. It worked fine in Spy because they were from opposing nations and Bond killed her lover. Here it seems to come out of nowhere. The most solid basis for Goodhead's frostiness is Bond's condescending remarks about her intelligence being uncommon for beautiful women, which I take issue with, but not for the reason that you might think. I don't buy that Bond has that attitude. I get that part of this is his game to seduce her, but it doesn't work for me. Besides, Moore's incarnation has already come across several fellow female intelligence operatives and a mystical witch, so I'm left confused as to why he goes this route. Maybe it's just me, but the charm doesn't play. Hugo Drax is another odd duck, but I lean much more positively with him. Script-wise, he's Stromberg again with a similar plan, but there are a number of small things that make him clearly the better of the two. First, Michael Lonsdale has a menacing monotone that really works. One minute he could be reading Shakespeare, and the next he could be barking orders at someone without changing much of his inflection, and they would both feel natural. Second, I think his plan is a little more thought out than Stromberg's, though there is one big question I have about it that I'll talk about later. Stromberg's new future after Armageddon never quite seemed thought out to me. Yes, he's obsessed with water and wants to lead the survivors beneath the sea, but how does he plan to get everyone else to go along with that? I always felt like I was missing something. Drax plans for a new perfect race of physical specimens that are loyal to him that he rules over, so his scheme feels a bit more fleshed out. Lastly, while I mentioned that the script was duller than some previous works, Drax gets some of the best and wittiest lines in the film. I don't know if it's Lonsdale's acting that sells them or something else, but I remember more of his individual lines and retorts than most of the other villains in the series. So kudos there. I missed my opportunity to talk about Chang in my henchman ranking video, but I don't know that I would have had that much to say about him there. Cast a blonde white guy in the role, and I don't think he would have stood out that much from people like Hans or Eric Kriegler. He's not awful at all, so he would go above them, but I don't feel much about him. He functions fine in the role, and that's about it. Jaws' return makes a much bigger splash, though not entirely for the right reasons. Richard Kiel is still fun in the role, but the increase towards slapstick with him I feel is a big blunder. It goes against what made him such a memorable presence in The Spy Who Loved Me. Jaws certainly had more comedic moments, but they were always balanced out with some more chilling material, and there are a couple of those here, but they are few and far between. Perhaps the most notable is in the alley with Manuela. His silent walk in the costume is so eerie. I kind of wish this was the first time we got to see Jaws in the film, as it would have been a powerful way to reintroduce him to the audience. But these kinds of moments are offset with him crashing into a circus tent from a free fall of several thousand feet, finding an instant girlfriend with Dolly at the cable car, and some really over-the-top expressions with him. It deflates much of the excitement I have for his reappearance. I'm not saying I want him to be completely serious and dark, but this feels like an overcorrection due to the number of fan letters received about the character. Turning him to the side of good in the finale feels motivated by the same thing, wanting to please those fans, though I'm more okay with that than the crescendo of silliness. It's a shame, really. I do like the two side Bond women here, though one is more effective than the other. Corinne Dufour is really memorable. Perhaps that's due to her seeming innocence and how she's subjected to quite a gruesome end by Drax's dogs, one of the most effective scenes in the film, by the way. She's also the final major part to be dubbed by longtime series veteran Nikki Vandersel, who had dubbed at least one female role in every official Bond film since Dr. No, with two exceptions. Manuela is just another stopgap Bond woman that serves as his contact in Brazil. She works well for the 5 minutes she's on screen, though I wish a way could have been found to expand her role, as she blips in and out of the picture without much fanfare. As far as production goes for this series, Moonraker is a mammoth one. Costing around $30 million, it was the most expensive of all the Roger Moore films, easily doubling Spy's budget. Yet you can't say that the money isn't apparent on the screen. Bond has had hit-and-miss special effects since the beginning, but Moonraker shows that the series has something to prove here. The shuttle launches are actually some of my favorites from any film in this era, with the flight into space sequence rightly being singled out for praise. I also love the way Drax's space station looks when it gets destroyed, as the filmmakers couldn't do with many explosions, hence the decision to use guns to shoot the model, and I applaud this choice. It gives it an almost otherworldly quality to its demise. Derek Meddings and crew already did a better job than usual with Spy, and here is one of their crowning achievements. This also ended up being the final Bond film for Ken Adam, making it his 7th. I get that he ruffled some feathers with how expensive his designs ended up being, but I feel like it was worth it. Moonraker boasts some stunning areas, like pretty much anything related to Drax, the centrifuge, the space station, the areas in the temple, and so on. John Barry comes back for his second attempt at a Roger Moore film, and I'm very split on this effort. It's an incredibly beautiful score overall, with Flight into Space being a standout. However, his music is what most stands in the way of my getting into Moonraker's action scenes. It's often too lethargic and legato-like, and it lulls me into a trance that doesn't vibe with the intensity of the action scenes. I do appreciate getting our 5th and final appearance of the 007 theme played during the boat chase. I've not talked much about this piece, as it's only really a staple of older films in the series and didn't survive the 70s. It's a great tune that has evolved and transposed into a different key from where it started in From Russia with Love. Moonraker is probably my least favorite version of it, but I hesitate to say it should be removed, as it was always a fun piece. I've talked before about Barry's tendency to hold back on the Bond theme, and I wondered if this was just the way he liked to work. Turns out, he seemed rather resentful of having to share some of the royalties of the scores with Monty Norman, the credited creator of the theme, and so it seemed like he pushed back where he could and tried to have his own material color the film. Thankfully, Barry is plenty talented that I find myself not missing the Bond theme as much as I do in some of the other films not scored by Barry, like GoldenEye or the Thomas Newman efforts. He was great at making the music sound appropriately Bondian without needing much of Norman's theme. I've also never been a huge fan of the title song, and I know I'm not alone in that, but it does score some points with me for having Shirley Bassey singing it. She can take the most mundane tune and make it sound like it's a number to bring the house down. I'm also quite partial to the major locations of the film. I've been to California plenty of times, though Drax's estate is the most French I've ever seen the place, though I have been to France as well. I fell in love with St. Mark's Square in Venice while I was touring there. And I lived for 2 years in Brazil, though that was in the Sao Paulo region. As much as I hate how flimsy the connecting tissue is between them in this plot, this is one of my favorite collections of locations. As far as space goes, I've never had a problem with the idea. Sure, it always seems to take a series into the realm of so-called science fact, according to Cubby, when it's introduced, but the Bond films were in a heightened reality anyway. Many of the gadgets and vehicles seem to be on this side of the extraordinary, so it would only take a nudge or two to make some of these films into bona fide science fiction. I just always accepted that space was someplace we might end up going to at some point, and besides, You Only Live Twice seemed comfortable with incorporating space into a Bond adventure, and the excellent video game Nightfire has Bond going into space with a climax, so I don't see why such a fuss should be made here. As I said, most of the action doesn't move the dial for me despite having some nice ideas, but there is one huge exception, and that is the pre-title sequence. The first in this series to feature the talents of B.J. Worth, Jake Lombard, and crew, I'm in awe that they even tried this. Special shoots had to be constructed. A support system was built for the cameraman so he wouldn't get killed shooting Panavision while skydiving with the stunt performance, and it took 88 jumps to complete the scene. Upon repeat viewing, some things really stand out, like how obvious it is that stuntmen have parachutes under their jackets, or that the shots are incredibly short, meaning that there are a lot more cuts than usual in editing. But I can easily forgive those things, as it's just an amazing looking sequence and wonderfully stimulating. It's my favorite part of the whole film. To close, I do have a few questions about this story. The first is with Holly Goodhead. She's revealed to be a deep cover operative of the CIA at Drax Industries. However, I'm surprised that throughout the course of the film, she's never told to work with Bond once he's revealed to her. I know this investigation is meant to be top secret, but I'm sure Holly would be sending regular reports to her superiors, and I don't think it would have taken too long for the CIA to figure out the new guy snooping around as 007. Considering that the Soviets in the last film considered the assignment to be important enough to open a diplomatic channel to the British and have Anya work with Bond, why wouldn't the CIA do the same here? Especially since Bond has worked with Felix Leiter several times by now on other top secret missions. My other question has to do with the space station. Drax has a radar jamming device, so no one is supposed to be able to pick it up from Earth. Okay, fine. However, I have a hard time buying that no one would figure out that Drax is up to no good in space. Maybe he would have been able to convince the world governments that the space station is for a legitimate purpose, but then how are they not alerted to its presence in orbit while it was being constructed? They have more than radar to monitor space even during the 1970s. And how come Holly doesn't know about the station, given that she was a lead scientist in Drax's organization? I know I'm thinking about this more than I probably should, and I don't apply this scrutiny to a lot of Bond films, but it was a question that grappled with my mind this last viewing, and I couldn't come up with an explanation, even if it was a flimsy one. Moonraker has a good film buried within it somewhere that can't seem to escape its more notorious aspects. It's not my least favorite Bond film, but it's one of the more frustrating ones because I can see the potential here, and these filmmakers just finished making a spectacular film just 2 years prior. It's a grand entry that largely feels like a true student of the previous films, but for every small step it takes forward, it takes a giant leap backward. A lot of reviewers have called it a cross between The Spy Who Loved Me and Star Wars, but I would hesitate to leave it at that. Most of the space material feels more influenced by 2001 than A New Hope, though saying Red Leader twice as background chatter and the final bit with the shuttle going after the probes feels very much taken from the latter. It's much slower and more opulent in its treatment of the material than A New Hope, which is probably for the best. But the original Star Wars succeeded because it was a great refreshment of rather standard storytelling devices and elements. It's not groundbreaking because it's the most forward-thinking film or the most advanced of its time. It's groundbreaking because it's a fantastic offering of the old-fashioned, made to remind us of why those elements have worked before and why they continue to be timeless. In that sense, The Spy Who Loved Me was a lot more like Star Wars. It's not terribly original for a Bond film, but it made those tropes feel fresh and new again. Moonraker weirdly feels tired, a regurgitation of what has been done before without much consideration before employing those same standards and fundamental pieces. It's just another Wednesday at the office, despite the luxurious stage upon which it performs its material. At the time, Moonraker benefited immensely from these same decisions. It was the highest grossing of the series until the Brosnan films, and it did stay with people. Most recall it as the one where Bond goes to space, but leaving it at that is condemning it to a cheap label. It is capable of soaring much higher than it does, but it's also content to be the same sandwich we got last time, just with snazzier new wrapping. The effects of this film did largely influence the direction of the series moving into the 1980s. Despite the success, the price tag was too much for United Artists, who in turn demanded that the budget be kept more in check for future films. The creators also felt that they had gone as far in scale as they should, and thus Bond should return to his roots. Instead of trying to top Moonraker in vision, the creators turned back to Ian Fleming and tried to do a more character-driven espionage entry. This was quite the gamble at the time, and it ushered in a new era for the series, one where the effects are still being felt over 40 years later.